So my title is Geddes and Renaissance, and I've spelt it in Geddes's way rather than McDermid's way, but it's all the same. So I begin with the point of origin, so to speak, Patrick Geddes's evergreen essay, This Scots Renaissance, published in 1895. So what for Geddes was requiring revival or rebirth in 1895? The answer to that question could cover everything from the specific condition of the old town of Edinburgh, including, of course, Riddle's Court, to the widest ecological understanding of the planet. But what he is focusing on in that essay is the importance of understanding one's own culture as a starting point. That immediate starting point for Geddes was the cultural pluralism of Scotland, historical, geographical, and linguistic. To make the point, he considers a number of key figures, in particular, the academic and cultural activist, John Stuart Blackie, the novelist Robert Louis Stevenson, and the Scots language poet and collector Alan Ramsay, and the early Celtic Christian leader, Saint Columba. Right, better use one of these things. The essay begins with the funeral of John Stuart Blackie, who had died in the March of that same year of 1895. For Geddes, Blackie epitomised an appreciation of Scotland and its place in Europe. Blackie was professor of Greek and at the University of Edinburgh, but in addition, he was a strong proponent of Celtic revival and Highland land rights. And one crucial outcome of his efforts was the raising of funds for a chair of Celtic at the University of Edinburgh. Blackie was also an advocate of Robert Burns's poetry and a translator of the ancient Greek poet Aeschylus. So, all in all, a very interesting figure. Blackie seems to have an implicit presence beneath the windows of the Geddes family flat in Ramsay Garden. For there, overlooking the Castle Esplanade, one finds a sundial bordered by quotations in the Greek of Aeschylus and the Scots of Robert Burns. It dates from 1892. The Aeschylus can be translated as "Time refines all things in aging them," and the Burns reads, "It's coming yet for all that." With these two statements from two poets, one originating in ancient Greece, the other originating in 18th century Scotland, Geddes emphasizes the mutual illumination of alphabets, of languages, of poets, and of periods of history. John Stuart Blackie's own translation of the Aeschylus quotation reads, "Time that smooths all things." So for Geddes, the message transmitted by the sundial quotations is that the smoothing power of time is enabling a better future, but that future is coming yet for all that. Now, John Stuart Blackie was a friend of a man for whom Geddes had great admiration, the Russian anarchist Peter Kropotkin. And it's particularly interesting to note that Kropotkin attended a party at Geddes's Edinburgh flat. This would not be the Ramsay Garden one, but I think the James Court one in 1886. Now, Kropotkin at the time was staying with Blackie, and Geddes's friend and close contemporary James Mavor, another very interesting figure of this network, describes the party in his autobiography. It must have been quite an occasion. Among those present was a young Norwegian studying with Geddes at the Marine Biological Station at Granton. This was Fridtjof Nansen, who would in due course become one of the greatest of all polar explorers. His presence underlines that for Geddes, a necessary part of cultural revival was scientific research. Now, Mavor also notes the presence at Geddes's party of the socialist thinker Thomas Kirkup. And in a most amusing sentence, he writes, "Kropotkin and I alternately hammered Marx, and Kirkup spoke up for him, and we had an excellent discussion." As I say, it sounds like quite a party. So Geddes's contact with Kropotkin, while the latter was staying with Blackie, provides further context for understanding the message of the Ramsay Garden sundial. One might even consider the historicist quotations from Aeschylus on the one hand and Burns on the other as Geddes's tribute not just to Blackie, but to Kropotkin also. A further tribute to Blackie came in the naming of Blackie House on the Mound in Edinburgh, a newly converted tenement that became one of Geddes's halls of residence in 1897, linking into others such as, of course, Riddle's Court. Now, that building was again given a physical signature, not with a sundial this time, but with the decoration of an oriel window looking towards Princess Street. On it is carved a portrait of Blackie, flanked by a thistle and a harp, as we see here. So Blackie's death was significant for Geddes, and it's not surprising that it is the starting point for his Scots Renaissance essay. But Geddes soon complements Blackie's role in that Renaissance with the role of Robert Louis Stevenson, who had died in 1894. Now, I had to cut this talk massively, and one bit that I cut out, but I think I'll reinstate, is how delighted I am that Michael Shaw has begun to bring Stevenson back to life from a revivalist perspective. But from Geddes's point of view, Stevenson is a good fit for his Scots Renaissance essay because, quite apart from being a brilliant writer, Stevenson was deeply knowledgeable about Scotland and, like Geddes, deeply internationally inclined. However, one might think that Geddes is being a bit nostalgic here, but in fact, his purpose is the reverse. The point for Geddes is that although individual people like Blackie and Stevenson die, their ideas do not, and the communities of which they are part do not. Thus, we see Geddes thinking in terms of social evolution, the continuous rebirth of culture with each generation building on the insights of its predecessors. However, Geddes is equally aware that each generation can exacerbate the failures of its predecessors also. That's where Renaissance comes in. It is essentially a question of leading social evolution in the right direction, taking heed of Blackie as Celticist and classicist, taking heed of Stevenson as both Scottish and global in attitude. Geddes's underlying point is therefore educational. He makes it forcefully when he laments the way Scottish education ignores Scottish culture, and by doing so, ignores the bases of Scottish success, both locally and internationally. And one might say much of what he says still applies today. For example, he is scathing of Scottish culture being recognized only through celebration rather than education. And I quote, we have gone on increasing our libations and orations every St. Andrew's Day, the same for St. Robbie's and now for St. Walter's, till all the world must perforce join our revels. But all this while the history we boast of has become well nigh unknown among us. Geddes's point is that it is not enough to celebrate one's culture through such stereotypes. One must teach it too, and that such education is fundamental to the Renaissance that is required. So the Scots Renaissance message is simply to teach and understand your own culture in an international context, or to put it another way, to attend to both Blackie and Stevenson in the curriculum, rather than just marking their passing. Geddes then anchors his essay in two other figures, one relatively recent, the 18th century poet Allan Ramsay, the other from a much earlier period, the Celtic saint, Saint Columba, whose monasteries in Iona and elsewhere created the manuscripts that the artists of Geddes's circle revisited in their work. In his Scots Renaissance essay, Geddes reflects not only on the person of the saint, but on the revival of that Celtic decoration. One finds that expressed in initial letters by Helen Hay and John Duncan, as we see here, from the first volume of the Evergreen. Further reference to St. Columba can be found in both Lyra Celtica, and I was delighted to hear a mention of that already, a remarkable anthology of Celtic verse published by Geddes and colleagues in 1896 and edited by Elizabeth Sharp, William Sharp's wife. And then in 1897, Columba is again mentioned in a booklet marking the 13th century of the saint's death. That drew on designs already published in the Evergreen, and here we see one by John Duncan on the cover. The Lyra Celtica one is by Helen Hay. And in the Scots Renaissance essay, Columba, the Gaelic speaker, is complemented by Alan Ramsay, the Scots speaker. The significance of Alan Ramsay is underlined in the prefatory note to the second volume of the Evergreen, which builds very much on what Geddes has said in the Scots Renaissance essay. This is how that note begins. In 1724, Alan Ramsay published his Evergreen, desiring thereby to stimulate the return to local and national tradition and living nature. We who inherit Ramsay's old home and would also follow in his steps as workers and writers, publishers and builders, seeking to gather such traditions as still linger around us, to set down such thought or song as may be in ourselves, hopeful at least of suggesting better things to those who will follow us here. Now, that paragraph sets out the wider Geddes project very clearly. Geddes called his publisher Patrick Geddes and colleagues, and that's a significant use of language, for those colleagues were, paraphrasing the prefatory note, along with Geddes, the inheritors of Alan Ramsay's old home, following in his footsteps as workers and writers, publishers and builders. Symbolic of that educational renaissance was the mural scheme for the common room of the student residence of Ramsay Lodge, where in 1896, Geddes drew on the work of 4 artists who were also working on the Evergreen. They created a remarkable sequence of murals bordered by and linked to one another by Celtic interlaced designs. The central mural panels are by John Duncan, and they survive today. Unfortunately, most of the borders, painted by Duncan's students, Helen Hay, Marion Mason, and Nellie Baxter, only survive as fragments. Photographs taken at the time give us some idea of what has gone missing, as we can see in this image, which shows the wonderful borders surrounding Duncan's Awakening of Cahulan. For Geddes, those interlaced borders were extremely important, and I will say more about them in a moment. But first, I will consider the central panels by John Duncan from Geddes's interdisciplinary perspective. The images chosen for those panels can be seen as a visual manifesto for Geddes's educational renaissance. They bring together legend, history, and interdisciplinary learning in a location dedicated to students. The anchor image, as we've already seen, is the Awakening of Cahulan, a work which identifies the need for Celtic revival, a manifesto work, if you like, a call to cultural awakening. It leads to the combat of Finn, which shows a scene derived from Macpherson's Ossian. And Ossian was a work which Geddes and colleagues would publish in a new edition edited by William Sharp in that very same year of 1896. The third panel moves us from the Gallic Celticism of Cahulan and Ossian to the Brythonic Celticism of King Arthur in the taking of Excalibur. The identification in the text accompanying the mural of Arthur with Arthur's seat in Edinburgh is probably erroneous, but the wider point is correct, namely that Brythonic Celtic culture, that's to say Celtic culture linked to what we now call the Welsh language, is important in the whole of the south of Scotland. And that is the point that Geddes is making. The next panel continues that southern Scottish theme with the image of the journey of St Mungo on his way to bury the body of St Fergus in the location of what is now Glasgow Cathedral. That mural thus introduces Christianity into this visual history of Scottish ideas, but with strong hints in the imagery of an earlier pagan bull cult. Following it is an image inspired by the writings of the great Irish theologian of the 9th century, the vision of Johannes Scotus Erigena. Johannes, or John Scotus Erigena, was the most renowned Gaelic-speaking philosopher and theologian of his time, and his work was studied throughout Europe. This mural thus makes the simple point that Celtic intellectual culture has its place at the heart of Europe. It also introduces for the first time a figure associated with what we would today call higher education. Now, that higher educational point is complemented in the next panel by the thinking of the early 13th century mage and scientist of European reputation, Michael Scott, renowned for not only his magical activities, which link up with the previous talk, I think, but also for his translations of Aristotle from Arabic to Latin. The final figure of the group, painted in 1896, is of the 16th century scholar, the Admirable Crichton. Crichton is shown during his visit to Venice, standing in the Piazzetta close to the Doge's palace. Crichton was the Scottish Renaissance scholar par excellence, traveling to universities in France and Italy in particular, and disputing and fencing wherever he went. His inclusion thus strikes his inclusion strikes a personal note for Geddes, for he is thought to have been educated at Geddes's old school, the Grammar School of Perth, before studying at St Andrews University. Thus, the scheme proceeds from legend through the beginnings of educational history to exemplary scholarship. At the same time, it begins with Celtic culture and becomes increasingly European, but never losing touch with its Scottish starting point. However, whatever the importance of John Duncan's panels, the now lost interlaced borders were also crucial to Geddes's conception of the Ramsay Lodge common room. The fact that they have much more than a mere framing function is made very clear in Geddes's own account of them. Leave the pictures then for a moment and take their tracery borders, he says, follow them round the walls, watch them until the interweaving threads begin to twist and the mazy spirals spin. Here are line and color woven into patterns, changing as they go, 16 designs round a single picture. There is no mechanical repetition as in more familiar styles. Each device is a separate living thought, a separate expression of a separate life moment of the artist, expressible only in the medium of line and color, like a chord of music. Now, some idea of the visual environment created can be gained from this composite of the images of the first two panels. As you can see, what Geddes and his artists had in mind was a total experience, a complete visual experience, and indeed intellectual experience. I would remind you that the scheme was carried out only a year after the publication of Geddes's Scots Renaissance essay. The Ramsay Lodge murals are thus an example of Geddes's Scots Renaissance in practice. The comparative interdisciplinary aspect of Geddes's thinking should be noted. It's the method that George Davey would later describe as the Scottish generalist tradition, or more concisely, the democratic intellect. In the democratic intellect, published in 1961, Davey notes Geddes as part of that Scottish generalist tradition. A few years later, in 1966, Davey's friend Hugh McDermid published the second volume of his autobiography, The Company I've Kept, in which both Davy and Geddes figure. So the Geddes link to Macdermid is surprisingly easy to make, for chapter 3 deals extensively with his work. Macdermid was also on terms of friendship with Geddes from the early 1920s onwards. It's interesting to note that their link seems to have come about when Geddes wrote to Macdermid after he had read his poetry, and that, in a way, links us back straight to Alan Ramsay. Thus, we find the Scots Renaissance of Patrick Geddes directly linked to the Scottish Renaissance of Hugh Macdermid through Macdermid's own words. I conclude with a quotation. What then is this Scotland of ours? What life does it actually show? What ideas and what aims are nascent among its youth? What manner of history will they make? What literature will they write? And we, what counsel in thought, what initiative in action can we offer them? Here are questions, as our Scottish manner is, to ask rather than answer, but to which at some other season we may well return. Now, if someone had told me that Hugh Macdermid had written that in the 1920s, I think I would have accepted it. But the author is Patrick Geddes in 1895 in his Scots Renaissance essay for the Evergreen. There's much else to say, but for the moment I leave you with the continuity of the Scots Renaissance of the 1890s and the Scottish Renaissance of the 1920s through the friendship and shared interdisciplinary commitment of Hugh Macdermid and Patrick Geddes. Thank you for listening.